Hey guys, this is Bry. I have epilepsy, and today we are going to figure out if I could beat Mew. Mew's status is 100 throughout. His moves by level up are bad, but he could get every TM and HM possible. So, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and remove the level up part. That means he could use TMs only by level up. So let's begin our battle. I used the Pokemon randomizer to get Mew right off the bat. I named him Kitty because, well, it's a kitty cat. My first battle is with my rival. He has a Squirtle, and I go ahead and take him out with 4 pounds for the win. Onto our first battle with a rock gym. First up is a Geodude, and it was rough, but I beat the first one. Next was Onyx, and it was tough. I had to resort to transform and knock away chip by chip. It was a close battle because I had just barely any HP left, but I won with one try. Before I go to another gym, I take a dome fossil because it will please the YouTube algorithm. Our second gym battle is with a water type. First up is Staryu, and we have no problems. Next up was the Starmie, and I missed a couple mega punches, but I eventually got Starmie down in one shot. Next up is a rival fight. His first move is a Pidgeotto. I got a two-shot win with that because Mega Punch missed one of them. Next up is Abra, so I went with Pound for chip damage. Third was Rattata or Ratatak, and I used Mega Punch and won. Lastly was his Squirtle, and it was a quick match. Onto the rival fight on the boat. First is the Pidgeotto, and I get a Mega Punch for a one shot. Next up was a Raticate. I used a Mega Punch to get a one shot. Third was Abra, and I also used a Mega Punch for a one shot. Lastly is the Wartortle, and I got a two shot with my Mega Punch for a win. My third gym battle is the Electric Gym. I got a one-shot with my first Pokemon, Voltorb. My second battle was Pikachu, and it was a one-shot. Lastly was a Raichu. I had to do 3 Mega Punches because one of them missed. Onto the rival fight in the cemetery. First up was Pidgeotto. I had a metronome, and it turns out I hit a headbutt for a knockout. Next up was a Growlithe. I used metronome again and hit with a slash for a one shot win. Next up was a Executor, and I used metronome and wrapped him up for a win. Next up was a Kadabra. I used metronome 3 times, and the third time was a one shot. Lastly was his War Turtle. I used 2 metronomes and got me the win. My fourth gym battle was a grass type, Weeping Bell. I learned Psychic, so that was a one shot. Next was a Tangela, and again, I one shotted with Psychic. Lastly was a Bioplume, but I won with Psychic. Next is the battle between Giovanni and Game Corner. His first move was a Onyx, and I used a Psychic for a one shot. Next was the Rhydon, and I used Psychic for a one shot. Next was the Kangaskhan, and I also did a one shot hit with Psychic. Onto my fifth gym battle, and it is a poison type. First up is a Coughing, and I got 2 Mega Punches to finish him. Next up is Monk, and I had Mega Punch him 2 times to fall down. Next up was another Coughing, and I Mega Punch. Lastly is a Wheezing. I used 3 Mega Punches to knock him down for good. Next up is the rival fight in Silph. First up is a Pidgeot. I use Psychic for the win. Next up is a Growlithe, and I got a one shot. Next up is a Executor, and I hit him with a Psychic for the win. Next up is Alakazam, and I used a Mega Punch for the win. Next up is a Blastoise, and 2 Psychics took him out. Next up is a boss fight with Silco. First off is Nidorino. I used a Psychic for a one shot. Next up was his Kangaskhan. I used a Psychic and it was a one shot. Next was the Rhyhorn. I used a Psychic for a one shot. Lastly was a Nidoqueen, and I used a Psychic for a one-shot again. The next gym battle was a Psychic. His first move was a Kadabra. I used a Mega Punch 3 times just because 2 of the times were missing. The third one hit for a knockout. Next was Mr. Mime. I used a Mega Punch for a one-shot and took him down. Next was Venomoth. I used a Psychic for a one-shot. Lastly was a Alakazam. I used a Psychic and a Mega Punch for the win. My 7th gym battle was a Fire type. His first Pokemon was a Growlithe. I used a Psychic for a one-shot. Second was a Ponyta, and I used a Psychic for a one-shot. His next Pokemon was a Rabbitash, and I used Psychic for a one-shot. Lastly, it was a Arcanine. I used a Psychic for the win. The 8th and final gym battle was Giovanni, the ground type moves. First up is a Rhyhorn. I used Psychic for a one shot. Next up was a Dugtrio, and I used Psychic for the win. Next was the Nidoqueen, and I used a Psychic for another one shot. Next was a Nidoking, and I got a Psychic for the win. Next was a Rhydon. I used a Psychic for a one shot and the win. Before the Elite Four, I have to get a rival fight. His first Pokemon is a Pidgeot. I use a Psychic for a one shot. Next was a Rhyhorn, and I got a Psychic for another win. Next was Growlithe, and yet again, I used Psychic for the win. Next up is a Execute, and I hit a Psychic twice for the win. Next up is Alakazam, and I got 2 Psychics for the win. Lastly was a Blastoise. I got 2 Psychics for the win. On to the Elite Four. First up is an Ice type. First was a Dugong, and I used 2 Psychics to knock him down. Next up is a Cloyster, and I went and got a Psychic for the win. Next up was a Slowbro. I used a Psychic, a Mega Punch, and Metronomes, but he fell. Next up is a Jinx, and I used 2 Psychics for the win. Lastly was a Lapras, and I used 2 Psychics for the win. The second Elite Four member was a fighting type gym. First up was a Onyx. I used a Mega Punch and 1,000 Metronomes, but he went down. Next up was Hitmonchan, and I used the Mega Punch for the win. Third was a Hitmonlee. I got 2 Mega Punches for the win. Next up was another Onyx, and I got a Pound and a Psychic for another win. His final Pokemon was Machamp. I used a combo of Mega Punches and Pound for the win. My third Elite Four battle was a Psychic type. He started with a Gengar, but I forgot to level up, so I had no moves for the Psychic left. So I restarted. My next battle was easier thanks to Psychic. First was a Gengar, which I used Psychic for. Next was a Golbat. I used 3 pounds for the win. Next was a Haunter. I used a Psychic a couple of times for the win. Next up was an Arbok. I used a combo of a Mega Punch and a Pound for the win. Lastly was another Gengar. I used a Psychic for the win. The last Gym Elite Four member was a Dragon type. First off, he had a Gyarados. I used a Psychic and a Pound for the win. Next, he used a Dragonair, so I used a Psychic for the win. He used another Dragonair, so I used a Psychic for the win. Next up was the Aerodactyl, so I used a Psychic for the win. Lastly is a Dragonair. I used a couple of Psychics, and finally he went down. Onto the champion. His first move was Pidgeotto, and I used a Psychic for a one-shot. Next was Alakazam, so I used a Mega Punch for a one-shotted win. Next was a Rhydon, so I used a Psychic for a one-shotted win. Next up was a Arcanine, and I got a Psychic for the win. Next was a Executor. I went and got 3 Psychics and took him out. Lastly was a Blastoise, and I took 2 Psychics for the ultimate win. Well, that was easy. My main problems were the first gym battle and the slip up in the Elite Four Ghost Gym. My time was 13 hours and 44 minutes. Not bad for a first time speed run. Like, subscribe, ring the bell for more shenanigans like these. Goodbye for now, and remember, we are much more than meets the eye.